This is an extract from the Leader podcast by the Evening Standard. The whole thing is available on all major podcast providers. At Prime Minister's Questions, Boris Johnson was repeatedly harassed by Sir Keir Starmer about the option of the UK having a so-called circuit breaker, shutting down the country for around 2 weeks to stop the spread of coronavirus. "I want to avoid the misery of another national lockdown," replied the PM. But
I rule out nothing, of course, in combating the virus. But we are going to do it with the local, the regional approach that can drive down and will drive down the virus if it is properly implemented.
some scientists are backing the idea of more stringent measures to control the virus, but it could cause enormous economic harm, with businesses warning of permanent closures if they're forced to temporarily shut their doors. Our editorial column says it's right to give the current three-tier system a chance to prove itself.
Circuit breaker may sound scientific, but for all the talk of it being only a short measure, the reality is that it is likely to turn into weeks. As the first lockdown showed, it's much easier to close things than to reopen them. There will be a severe danger of drifting on until Christmas, as the lag between restrictions and their effects will not be seen until close to the festive season. Instead, it seems sensible to give the new three-tier system, unveiled on Monday, time to prove its efficacy. It is more focused than a crude national shutdown, and means that lockdown can still be imposed in the worst affected areas, while leaving other parts with fewer infections free of excessive restrictions.
Our deputy political editor Nicholas Cecil is here. There's a lot of pressure being applied on the government to impose a circuit breaker, Nicholas. Is it on the cards?
It's not on the cards immediately. Boris Johnson at Prime Minister's Questions at lunchtime today did not rule it out, but he made clear that what the government want to do at the moment is to try to give their new three-tier system time to see whether it can get a grip with this coronavirus epidemic.
And three-tier system has barely started, really, hasn't it?
Yes, it only actually comes into force today. It will apply definitely to Liverpool. There's also a gold-level meeting between ministers and officials today to discuss putting other areas, particularly in the North and Midlands, into Tier 3. But there's already growing opposition to that, being led by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. And some of the town hall leaders up there in Manchester area are now saying that they would prefer a circuit breaker rather than going into Tier 3, which they fear will last for weeks and weeks, if not months and months.
What is the opposition within the Conservative Party to doing a circuit breaker and, obviously having to close down all those businesses and the pubs and the restaurants and all the things that entails?
Well, the concerns are mainly the economic damage that such a circuit breaker would do. For example, former Tory leader Ian Duncan-Smith was saying this morning, this is not a circuit breaker, it's a business breaker. There are also doubts among some people on the Tory backbenchers over how effective it will be. But politically, there's also been a development now because the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, is firmly backing a circuit breaker, which was recommended by the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies 3 weeks ago. And so there's a clear political dividing line now. He's saying that it's needed to avoid the country sleepwalking into a long and bleak winter. Now, what he's proposing is not closing schools, but you would see pubs, bars and restaurants close, with compensation for firms so that they didn't lose out. But even so, it would be very damaging to some businesses.
So did Sir Keir Starmer's, I suppose, intervention last night make it harder for the government to say, OK, let's do the circuit breaker option?
Yes, it does, because the government has already made a series of U-turns during the coronavirus crisis. And this is the first time that Labour has very much put itself at odds with the government strategy, which will make the government more reluctant to go for a circuit breaker.
If the government is then asking people to give them a bit of time to see if the tier system works, has there been any indication of how long that will be needed?
No, new measures normally take 2 to 3 weeks before it's clear whether they're having an impact. And certainly the number of cases and hospitalizations and very unfortunately deaths linked to COVID have been rising in many areas. So there's a feel that perhaps the government is again behind the curve on fighting the virus. In Northern Ireland this morning they announced a lockdown, and in Wales they are seriously considering such a move.